Fortunately for me, I had a mentor who said to me, I think you should really go into private practice. I think you could make a thing of it. I think you'd be very successful. And I just looked at her and I was like, people like me don't go into private practice. And she's like, I don't know what you mean by people like you. You are you. You are not people like you.
This is Therapist Clubhouse, a podcast for private practice entrepreneurs. I'm Annie Schusler. This week, I'm talking to Rajani Venkatraman Levis, a private practice entrepreneur in San Francisco. She specializes in EMDR and culturally attuned therapy. Listen as she dives into her entrepreneurial journey from the very personal to the nitty-gritty. Welcome, Rajani. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Annie. It's such a pleasure to be here on the Therapist Clubhouse.
Thank you. So there are a few big reasons why I wanted to share you with my listeners. And a few of those are, and we'll see what else comes up today, but you've really mastered public speaking and presenting. And that's something that a lot of therapists aspire to and would love to get more into. And you've also stepped forward as a mentor, especially for therapists of color who are newer to the field. So I want to talk about those things and a few other things. So let's start with your private practice. How long have you been in private practice?
Well, I want to actually back up just a little bit, Annie, and say you really upped the ante, didn't you? I mean, once you've said that somebody has mastered public speaking, now you've put me on the spot. Now I feel like I'm going to have to show up in some amazing way.
We can come up with a different way of talking about that, but you do public speaking. And so I do regularly.
Yes, I do enjoy talking and presenting, and I like connecting with people in that way. But it was interesting to have that reflected back to me the way that you did. So thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear the way other people see you, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, those of us who are in this field as therapists who know that we are here because we have a gift for seeing people in their wholeness and inviting that into the room. And yet each of us still needs that reflection from each other to see, how do you see me and how am I showing up in the world? Thanks for letting me know. So thank you, Annie.
You're so welcome. Yeah, well, so actually, how long have you been doing public speaking? When did that start in your career?
I think it started in my childhood. But,
okay. Yeah.
But I think to answer your question, I've been in private practice 5 years, and I think a lot of the public speaking started with presentations in graduate school. And I had one professor who was a mentor who wrote in my evaluation after a presentation, you should do more of this. You should consider teaching and presenting and speaking and creating workshops. And I think that was when a particular seed was planted in relation to public speaking in this profession.
And then how's that developed? What kinds of presenting and workshops and stuff have you taken on?
So I taught at San Francisco State University, which is my alma mater, for about 5 years, and really enjoyed that particular model of presenting, of figuring out how do you help people who are about to become therapists to find their way into the field. So I taught several different classes, but one of the things I enjoyed most was facilitating and co-creating experiences for students to experience and explore themselves, their relation to their vocation, right? Which, because what we do for work as therapists is a vocation, and helping students to integrate the intellectual component with the rest of them so that the whole mind-body comes in together. How do my experiences play into how I receive this information and how it becomes a part of who I am? And that got me very curious about how do we create this in other ways. So I think one of the biggest and most enjoyable workshops or trainings that I created was from a grant from the Kampft Educational Foundation. And I had this idea based on my students' experiences that there was a lot of curiosity. How do you get into private practice? How does that work? Especially as a state school, the model is much more focused on community mental health, and a lot of our students end up going towards community mental health. We have a very diverse program. And yet, when you see a program with more therapists of color, you also notice that it becomes very oriented towards community mental health, and there's not much information about private practice. And that said, even those who go to other schools often talk about how little information they received about the business of psychotherapy when they were in school, and all of the learning had to come after. And so I got a grant to create this incredible event, a day-long event, and we had about 150 people who came. And to my surprise, more than a third of them were actually licensed clinicians. I want to say about half the people who came there were probably licensed clinicians. And that was very surprising to me because I had thought of creating an event for students. And it turns out that a lot of people are still hungry for this, right? Which is why the Therapist Clubhouse is really helpful as a way for people to learn more about what are other therapists in private practice doing? What do they charge? What is their business model? What do they struggle with? What other things do they do other than just seeing clients, right? So, and I spoke about the things that I'm most passionate about the need for diversity in this field, the need for diversity in private practice specifically, and therefore encouraging students of color to consider the possibility of private practice and not just feel like they were being funneled into community mental health.
Yeah. How do you think that funneling happens? What are some of the ways that kind of expectation gets put on people?
A big piece of it is modeling. You do what is shown to you. And if you do not see yourself represented in a particular arena, it is much harder to picture yourself in that arena.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And harder to picture who you'd be getting support from, who your peers would be, who you could really trust.
That was my story as well, of going into community mental health because I couldn't even fathom private practice. As an immigrant who moved here when I was 21, and my family, nobody's done therapy, and they don't, my parents don't even live here in this country. So to build your life anew and to look for, okay, what do people like me do? And the model in front of me was go into community mental health. They work for nonprofits. And so I did that for several years. And at some point when I got laid off yet again, because that's a big challenge with community mental health, right? The sustainability. You're working with very high caseloads. You're working with a lot of trauma. You're working with systemic factors that you often can't address. And there's a very high rate of burnout. For example, in the domestic violence field, 2.5 to 3 years tends to be the turnover rate, right? People leave an agency in 2.5 to 3 years often.
Absolutely.
It's not sustainable. So then what happens to people when they keep working in fields that are not, in areas that are not sustainable? They get burnt out even more, and then people consider, what are my viable alternatives? Fortunately for me, I had a mentor who said to me, I think you should really go into private practice. I think you could make a thing of it. I think you'd be very successful. And I just looked at her and I was like, people like me don't go into private practice. And she's like, I don't know what you mean by people like you. You are you. You are not people like you. And she said, give it a shot for 3 months. If you can't start to make a go of it in 3 months, then, cast a wider net and you'll find something else that you want to do. And I actually did make a go of it in the first 3 months.
Wow, I love her. So she kind of made it smaller. Like, well, what about this? What was your biggest fear or reservation about private practice at that moment?
I think it had always been how I framed private practice in my head, which was, in the graduate program, while other students would occasionally talk about, oh yeah, I want to go into private practice, I never envisioned that for myself. everybody in my family has always worked for someone else. Nobody in my family has been an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of being an entrepreneur was very intimidating. I wouldn't even know how to start. How do I do that? I don't know how to put myself out there. I don't know how to get business. Could I create a sustainable business? Would people want to come to me? Am I good enough? Where does one find clients? How does one advertise a business? Oh my God, the bookkeeping is going to be a nightmare. Just even the little idea of, oh my God, but if I work for myself, I'd have to get my own health insurance. That just sounds terrifying in and of itself, right? Like all these small obstacles that then add up to a big mindset.
Yes. And it could be almost anything that sort of puts that feeling of overwhelm into our minds. Like for somebody, it's hearing about there's something called an EIN number. Oh my God, I don't know what that is.
Right.
And we know like they're all doable. They're all like just these small steps and you just go through them one by one. But yeah, if you try to look at the whole thing, there are going to be so many things in there that are overwhelming or you don't know what they are, or you've got to have somebody believe in you. And it sounds like that was one thing that really made a difference, was this person saying, yeah, I mean, if you can do this, I know you can do that.
Absolutely. I think, to your point of all of the small things, and it could be almost anything. I think there is something about being an immigrant and being a person of color, right? Which also adds to feeling like you are at sea with something new. And you've had many experiences of that. In fact, you have actually cultivated much more resilience through those experiences. And yet, many of those experiences in which you felt lost in the moment may also leave kind of a veneer of, oh yeah, I'm never going to figure it out because I keep encountering these situations. So to give you a really quick example, within like the first week of having moved to San Francisco, back in, 97, I'm standing at Safeway, right? This is my first time ever entering a Safeway. Yeah. And I'm at the checkout counter and the woman says paper or plastic. And I pull out my credit card and I say plastic. And she starts to bag my groceries. But I have no idea, that she's asking how I want my groceries bagged. We are having a conversation and each meaning different things. Paper currency or plastic, which would be a credit card, right, could easily be one interpretation if you don't know the context. And in that context, paper or plastic is short for how do you want your groceries bagged, which we don't even ask the plastic question anymore.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And so very similar to that when it comes to thinking about private practice, when you don't know what the questions are, but you know that you're going to have many choices to make, and that the array of choices themselves may not make any sense to you. Therefore, how am I going to make a decision here? It's like if you go to breakfast in a new country and someone gives you 3 choices, right? Now, you, Annie, would know if someone said white wheat or rye that they're asking what kind of toast you want. But if someone has not defined that the category of the question is toast, but says to you as you order your eggs, white wheat or rye, you have no idea.
You're like, no, no, I want eggs.
So my experience with my own resistance to private practice was born out of this, I don't understand the decision categories, therefore I'm probably not going to make decisions, and every decision is going to be really painful. So why would I torture myself when I could just go work for somebody else who will make those kinds of decisions and tell me to just go see clients? So it was an interesting journey to kind of navigate all of the cognitions that I had internalized around my inability to navigate something new until I could actually reconcile with how many times have you done this? If you've, gone from the whole paper plastic all the way to, I can navigate creating an S corporation and actually being able to talk about it, well, you've come a long way, girl.
Yes. Tell me about your business. What has your private practice ended up at this point being like?
I think of the work that I do as culturally congruent therapy, and that it is the art and science of building bridges between cultures. That even when we are working with two people who belong to the same culture, we have so many layers within the culture, the family culture, the social culture, the more universal culture of our humanity, the culture of the region that you grew up in, right? And all these pieces become layered in the work that we do. And in my work, I feel fortunate to be a psychotherapist, a consultant, a counselor educator, a writer, a community builder. And so I get to bring these pieces together in the work that I do.
Well, so you do a lot of client work, and I know some of the things that you do are EMDR focused. Mm-hmm. And I know that you are definitely passionate and a go-to person about culturally competent therapy. So how does it all, I'm sure it's in motion, but how does it all fit together for you right now?
So I like to think of myself as a global citizen who also happens to be a trauma specialist, right? So as a bicultural, multilingual woman of color, my area of specialization and my interest happens to be where my personal and my professional life intersect, right? So kind of an interesting crossroad where various diversity factors intersect with adverse life events. So everything from divorce to illness to death to life transitions to immigration to cultural trauma to working with a mean boss to working within an oppressive system or systemic oppression, all of that. And I may not have all the same experiences as my clients or, somebody who's in a training or workshop that I'm offering, but I've had the gift of many diverse life experiences on two continents that express a whole range of possible human adventures. And I've had also the gift of time, space, support, and nurturance, right? Support, you already heard quite a bit about that. And I've had this gift from the time and space and support in order to acknowledge and introspect, to review, to kind of postmortem, to identify, to name, to process and then reprocess my adventures to the extent that I now have a strong sense of how and what I learned during these times. And that helps me to show up more in context and more embodied in my mind so that I can be mind and body integrated more and more. And the more I do that, the more comfortable I feel showing up in new places with new people. And talking about the humanity of it all is, I think, what has helped me to feel comfortable speaking with others in public venues.
I guess I'm thinking that some of that magic is there, whatever you're doing, like whether you're being a therapist or whether you're sharing information with people, teaching people, or facilitating a group, that I'm just sort of getting this feeling that that's got to be there in all of those situations.
I think the gift of the last few years for me, Annie, has been to let go of some of the things that I learned intellectually about how to be a therapist and to embody how I want to be as a person. And I don't have such a hard split between who I am as a therapist and who I am as a person, the way that I did when I was a new therapist, when I was an intern. The more I have relaxed into me as the person, the easier it is for me to show up as therapist or as consultant or as teacher or trainer or friend or student or as a client somewhere else, right? And I've had a lot of help and support in kind of moving more in that direction of feeling integrated in my being.
It's interesting. One thing that just flashed in my mind when you said that is one thing that's shifted for me over the last several years is dressing as the same person pretty much everywhere I go.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I want to show respect and I will dress, up when I need to, but I have noticed that I don't have a separate wardrobe in the way that I used to. And I think it's just, people should do whatever they want in terms of how they dress as clinicians. But for me, there's something symbolic about that shift.
I remember that early on, I actually did have, these are my work clothes, and then I change before I have my home life. But now I still have other ways in which I need to separate so that I don't carry the emotional content with me into my personal life, just as I need to keep some of, what I'm working through personally and not have that become a part of the client's process or something the client has to deal with, right? I still need that, but I do it in different ways.
I know one thing that you've mentioned to me before, and it always stuck with me, was that you create silence for yourself.
I do.
Yeah, so that you don't just rush from one place to the next, listening to things, that you create some space for yourself. Is that part of that way of making that separation?
Absolutely. More and more these days, I make a habit every day of having a period of silence. And the way that I think about it is I consume a lot during the day. I consume, billboards as I'm driving around, right? I consume the news. I consume what my clients are talking about. But there's a lot of input. And that at the end of the day, I need time where I am not taking in anymore so I can devote that time to digesting, to assimilating what needs to be assimilated, to eliminating what needs to be eliminated. And so during the period of silence, sometimes I will write because I feel okay with output, but not with input. And so it's a way of creating some balance where I have to pause on taking in more in order to digest and assimilate that which I took in. And it really helps me to tune in to those moments in session where something significant happened, and maybe something that the client said perhaps pinged something for me, or maybe I tensed my body in some way, right? Because we do loan our nervous systems to our clients in order to co-regulate with clients in therapy, right? Yeah. And so it's a way of reclaiming my nervous system and letting go of all the things that I stored for my client or all the things that I put on hold in a given moment because that wasn't the time to focus on it. But now is. And so coming back to now is the time for me to dive in and really savor my beingness in this moment. Feel my feelings deeply. Feel the joy of something a client said, come back to it. Feel the sadness or the heaviness that was in the room that I couldn't fully get into in that moment. Or feel my own feelings of tenderness for a client, in a slightly deeper way. That I need to in order to acknowledge my own humanity in this.
I'm hearing that this is a way that you've got a superpower around this. And this is, that's something I'm always thinking about. Yes. And that silence and that space is a way that you're really able to fuel it and feed it and nurture it.
It was something that was recommended to me by a mentor, and I wanted to brush it off.
Oh, really? So this didn't come naturally to you?
I used to journal.
Yeah.
But in a particular time, one of my mentors said, think about taking a period of silence every single day for the next 6 months and see how that sits with you. And I thought, that sounds terrible.
That's so great that you're sharing that, because I bet a lot of people listening are like, that's great for her, but that sounds hard. So you sharing that it did sound hard to you, I think is really helpful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounded hard. And I was like, really? And I was like, what am I allowed to do? Like, what am I allowed to do during that? And they're like, well, you could take a bath. And I'm like, can I listen to music in the bath? No, you have to just sit quietly in the bath. And I was like, what?
So it was kind of an acquired taste.
It was really an acquired taste. And, but the taste has grown so, just vividly in time that I now feel like I couldn't not do it.
Yeah.
I am so enriched by it. It is also, in a way, my dream time. It's my time that allows me to tune in deeply to, what does my being need? Mm-hmm. Does my being need more silence? Does my being need more nourishment? Does my being need more entertainment? Does my being want to come alive with play? Like, what am I enjoying and what am I feeling is missing from my life? Like, it's a time that allows me to tune in deeply to, what is my need? I spend so much time nourishing other people's need that it is easy as a therapist for me to forget that I need to attune to myself as deeply as I would my dearest client.
Yeah. And that if we keep doing that, then we can keep doing this work.
Absolutely. And it allows my work to go in new directions. And I think it has allowed me to say, oh, my need now is to write about this. Okay, the words want to flow. Or my need right now is to talk more with other people about this. My need now is to scream this from the rooftops. So please, universe, can you give me a venue so I can talk about these things that I'm so passionate about? But it is the tuning in that then lets me feel like, okay, this is what my being wants. How do I make that happen next?
Mm-hmm. And so for you, it seems like your business is not, it's not this really separate entity from you as a person, but that all of the things that we were talking about that you do, like the writing and the speaking and seeing clients and consulting, it sounds like, tell me if I'm just reading too much into this, but it sounds like it all comes from you tuning into what you're drawn to doing next.
Absolutely. I went back and I looked at some journals recently in which I had daydreamed, 5 years ago and 3 years ago and so on. And I noticed how the things that I was like, oh my God, I don't know how this could even be possible, but this is how many clients I want, right? And then I noticed how that happened. And I wrote in my journal a couple years ago, I really want to have my student loan paid off in 2017. And believe you me, I paid it off a couple months ago.
Oh, congratulations. Wow. Wow.
And so it was just this recognition as I looked over at past journals of how much that speaking to myself, speaking with myself, listening deeply to what I'm feeling and noticing and thinking and experiencing then allows me to open up space for that to unfold.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you some nitty-gritty questions about your business?
Let's get gritty.
Okay.
Let's get gritty.
So what do you charge?
I charge $165 for a 45-minute session, and I charge $1,500 for a day-long training.
Oh, tell me about the day-long training.
Right now, the training that I'm doing a lot of is called, it goes by different names at different times, depending on the group, but it's about how the client's resilience benefits the therapist. So I did a 3-hour presentation on it at CAMFT, and it's called Resilient Client, Resilient Therapist. But it incorporates several interesting facets. So one is this understanding that when you can really elicit the strengths of your clients and their resilience that has allowed them to even show up in your office, that they have overcome many, many obstacles that they didn't even realize were obstacles, where they may have told themselves stories about their own incompetence, where in reality they actually overcame a hurdle. So for example, right, I could tell the story of, the 4 year to go or paper or plastic and say, God, like I never got it. And I've always been that person. I'll never get it. Or we could talk about it in this way of I've had so many of those experiences that now allow me to show up knowing that we can all have those kinds of lost in translation experiences where we feel less than, and yet we build resilience from being in that experience. And so I have a model of what I wrote about for a book on EMDR therapy and cultural competence of community cultural wealth resources. It's a framework based on critical race theory writings, wherein we talk about the strengths that are really apparent in folks who come from the non-dominant culture, but that become invisible over time because they are not valued in the eyes of the dominant culture, and how as therapists we can learn to elicit these invisible and hidden strengths and privilege those in the room. And that as we do that, our clients' resilience becomes so vivid in the room, and we are made vicariously resilient by that. So the term vicarious resilience was coined by Pilar Hernandez in her work, where she interviewed therapists who were working with torture survivors in Colombia. And as she interviewed these therapists, and she said, how do you do this work without getting burnt out? She unearthed that we can become vicariously resilient when we focus on our clients' resilience and not just what the problem is, right? So it's a very strength-based approach. And vicarious resilience is of self-care for therapists. It can act as a protective factor against trauma and against vicarious trauma and burnout and secondary PTSD. And so focusing on this kind of how do we elicit the strengths, especially in this particular political climate? How do we elicit the strengths of our clients who don't come from the dominant culture? Whether we're talking about our LGBTQ clients, whether we're talking about a client of color, an undocumented immigrant, right? So how do we elicit their strengths of having navigated a system that wasn't created with them in mind, or a system within which they are subject to many challenges? And how do we help them feel that resilience? And as a result, therapy moves very quickly because their strengths then become the ally in resolving that which they came to therapy to get support with. So it's a really lovely way for me to show up somewhere and help build even more community, and to feel like my life experiences, my curiosity, my personal and professional interests can be of value in creating more community healing.
If you look back and you are able to time travel back to that point that you talked about earlier when you decided to just dive into private practice and see what it would be like, what would you tell the Rajani of that time?
I would say, sweetheart, you already know how to build community. Just trust in that. And there are hands to hold you. You just have to look, and you have to be brave enough to take the risk to just ask, hey, can we talk? And everybody's going to show up for this conversation way more than you even imagined possible. And that has been a very surprising truth for me. I didn't realize that all I had to do was start reaching out to therapists and saying, hey, do you want to talk? Can we connect? Do you want to have a cup of tea? All we have to do is ask. And maybe every now and then somebody's having a bad day and might not reach back out to you right away, but just keep reaching out. There are so many loving, caring, generous therapists who are out there just waiting to share. And there's you, Annie. I mean, look at all the things that you put out in the community, right, as resources, like this therapist clubhouse, right? But also with your newsletters that I've been getting for so long. It's so wonderful, the gift that so many therapists want to give each other,
Thank you, Rajani. Yeah, that there's really, it's like I just sort of get this image of you encouraging the Rajani of that time, and all newer therapists just look up, don't be afraid to ask for help. I mean, what a great way that this all turned out, that you've ended up then being this huge resource for therapists.
Right? I mean, you never know where it will take you if you can just trust that there are resources out there, and all you have to do is reach out for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel so lucky that somehow I figured it out, even though I didn't really think it was true at the time. Yeah. And now I get to point out, hey, every time I want to go down that rabbit hole again, I get to say to myself, hey, look how far we've come, and look how many wonderful people want to do this with each other.
Rajani, would you join me for a listener question?
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Listener question.
Beautiful. So this person asks, I am newly licensed and starting a private practice while I'm still working in an agency. I'm trained in EMDR and love trauma work, but I don't want my entire caseload to be trauma. How can I be known as a trauma therapist but still attract clients who have other issues?
I love this question. It's so honest, and it's something that people do struggle with. So I'll start by defining trauma in its broadest sense, which is any event that leaves a lasting negative impact. So we can think of EMDR therapy as being highly effective in resolving not just trauma, but adverse life events. So to give you an example, client grew up in a really low SES neighborhood, and life itself for her family may or may not have been that traumatic when you think about, big T traumas. But the exposure to harsh life circumstances was an adverse life event that had many lasting negative impacts. So she, now in her 30s, had worked very hard. She'd saved up enough money that she could afford to make a down payment to buy a 2-unit property. And she wanted to rent one out and live in the other one. But what she was struggling with was an underlying belief that all landlords are evil, mean people who take advantage of others. So it kept her from wanting to buy the property. Right? And that underlying belief was created by the adverse life experience of living in a low-income neighborhood where she repeatedly witnessed friends and neighbors and strangers being unceremoniously evicted. And so even though the experience didn't happen to her family directly, the impact for her as a child of watching this occur around her on a regular basis, of being reminded that she was lucky to have a roof over her head, while at the same time constantly breathing in the fear that it could happen to her one day. And so her mind didn't have a more balanced picture that landlords could also be people, who were compassionate or kind, or that it might break a landlord's heart to have to evict a family, but they need the income too. Her experience, unfortunately, had been with slumlords, albeit indirectly, but that was her experience, and it left this lasting impact on her. So this was her trauma. And so the gift of EMDR therapy is that it can uncover hidden events, memories, cognition, symptoms that have been locked in our mind, body, and are secretly influencing our thoughts, our feelings, experiences, behaviors, beliefs, fears, physical symptoms, and so on, right? And she could be free of this. So doing trauma work doesn't have to be like, I only work with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Right. I mean, I do specialize in working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but there are many other intersections. You could work with performance enhancement work within the EMDR therapy area. You could work with corporations or executives or with athletes or others who need that expertise to excel. You could work with those struggling with eating disorders, or specialize in treating couples and utilize EMDR therapy to support greater empathy for each other.
Yeah. And I think one thing I'm hearing you speaking to is the difference between being known as a quote trauma therapist or being known as an EMDR therapist, and that those aren't necessarily the same things. And then I also love how you're complicating what does it mean to be a trauma therapist.
Right.
It's not necessarily just the big T trauma that the listener might be thinking about when they say, I don't want my whole caseload to be trauma.
I wish this listener the very best with allowing this to unfold so you can attract the clients who are most needing of your superpower and allow EMDR therapy to be a modality that really aids you in supporting your clients to meet their goals. And like Annie and I have been talking about, there's plenty of support for you to get there. So don't feel like you have to do it alone, because we would love to help.
How can people find you, learn more about your training, and throw compliments at you, Rajani?
People can find me on my website, which is levistherapy.com. I also have a resource for therapists, which is talkingaboutTherapy.com, which is a website that I created as a resource just to house tons of information that I accessed over the years in building my private practice. Shoot me an email if you'd like to hear more about the training or have it come to your agency.
Thank you so much, Rajani.
I really enjoyed being here, Annie. Thank you for letting me go, on many different and fun tangents inside of myself.
They were all awesome. Thank you so much. Here's an idea to try.
Idea to try.
Try some more quiet. I know I'm going to after that conversation. I loved how Rajani shared both how much she loves quiet now and how much she resisted it at first. So whatever level of quiet you're comfortable with now, try expanding it just a little bit. So I'm really into listening to podcasts, as you could probably guess. So often I have a podcast going when I'm walking my dog or doing the dishes or have other potentially quiet moments. So I'm going to recommit to unplugging some of the time and noticing how that nurtures both me and my businesses. Thanks for listening to Therapist Clubhouse. Find articles, show notes, links for everything we talked about, and free training at coachingwithannie.com. I am newly licensed. Let me say that again.